Hello everyone, welcome to yet another video in this, the Clown Decade, the decade where things are only going to get worse before they get better. And today the subject is a mixture of things, but mainly the subject of how even our elite parliamentarians don't seem to understand how Parliament actually works. And the subject in question is Kenneth Clarke, who has served within the Cabinet and as an MP since 1970 up until 2019 when he stepped down after going against Boris Johnson's no-deal Brexit vote. So this man has been in Parliament for close to 50 years, or was in Parliament for close to 50 years, and then instantly got into the House of Lords with Boris Johnson appointing him in there in September 2020. And while in Parliament, he's been on the back benches. He was Home Secretary, Councillor of the Exchequer, Father of the House of Commons, President of the Tory Reform Group, was Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, Health Secretary, Education Secretary. He's been all sorts of things. I think it's fair to say that Kenneth Clarke is about as veteran as you get for a parliamentarian, and yet doesn't actually seem to understand how the whole system works, and we'll get into his speech rather soon. But the point I want to make here is that even if our veteran parliamentarians don't understand how Parliament works and how parliamentary sovereignty works, then it's no wonder that our politics is in the mess that it is currently in. Anyway, when the Rwanda bill that Rishi Sunak is trying to rush through to try and at least get some people deported to Rwanda, Kenneth Clarke made a 10-minute long speech in the House of Lords about the issue, and so that is what we're going to review. So, take it away please, Mr. Clarke.
I listened to quite a lot of the debate on the illegal migration bill and contributed to it once or twice because I had difficulty making my mind up as to whether I was going to support it.
All right, fair enough. That's exactly what you should be doing as a Lord in the House of Lords. Very good, Mr. Clarke.
And eventually, although I expressed my reservations about whether Rwanda was a suitable place, I was persuaded that it was a good thing to support, and I gave it my backing.
Excellent. You can tell from the start of this speech that he is clearly a very experienced statesman. Clearly, as he states, he put his thought into it, he weighed up the pros and cons of each side and said, yes, it seems like a reasonable place to send people who are illegally coming into the country. Excellent work. That's what I expect from all our lords.
Unfortunately, in the sight of subsequent events, we now have this bill, and at the moment, having considered it carefully, I must say I think the details of this bill, or its main point, as in Clause 2, are a step too far from me.
So for full context, Mr. Clarke has an issue with Clause 2 of the Safety of Rwanda bill that effectively Rishi Sunak is trying to push through to say that by law Rwanda is considered a safe country by Parliament. And so giving it a quick look, Clause 2 says this: every decision maker must conclusively treat the Republic of Rwanda as a safe country. A decision maker means the Secretary of State or an immigration officer when making a decision relating to the removal of a person to the Republic of Rwanda under any provision of or made under the Immigrations Act, a court or tribunal when considering a decision of the Secretary of State or an immigration officer mentioned in paragraph A. As a result of subsection 1, a court or tribunal must not consider a review of or an appeal against a decision or Secretary of State or an immigration officer relating to the removal of a person to the Republic of Rwanda to the extent that the review or appeal is brought on the grounds that the Republic of Rwanda is not a safe country. In particular, a court or tribunal must not consider any claim or complaint that the Republic of Rwanda will or may remove or send a person to another state in contravention of any of its international obligations, including in particular its obligations under the Refugee Convention, any claim or complaint that a person will not receive fair and proper consideration of an asylum or other similar claim in the Republic of Rwanda, or any claim or complaint that the Republic of Rwanda will not act in accordance with the Rwanda Treaty. Subsection 3 and 4 apply notwithstanding any provision made by or under the Immigrations Act, the Human Rights Act 1998, to the extent disapplied by Section 3, Disapplication of Human Rights Act 1998, any other provision or rule of domestic law, including any common law, and any interpretation of international law by the court or tribunal. So to put that all into plain English, what this bill is saying, or this clause is saying, is that you effectively have to ignore every claim or complaint made by anyone who is being sent to Rwanda based on their claims that it's either not a safe country or they may be deported from Rwanda, as the law states and Parliament states that Rwanda is a safe country. And he has a problem with that, so let's hear what his problems are.
My motive was, firstly, I do think it is necessary to have a credible and effective policy on illegal migration.
Yep, absolutely. And given that absolutely every other avenue seems to be stopped by lawyers, making a law that they literally cannot fight against seems to be the only avenue left.
It's a big problem, it's growing. It's small in relation to our total migration, but its symbolic effect on public opinion is very important. I think the public need to be reassured that we have control of immigration into this country.
So that's absolutely fine. I've got no problem with Ken Clarke's opinions here at all. He's served under multiple Tory Prime Ministers, going all the way from the wetness of Ted Heath to the based economically liberal side of Margaret Thatcher. And pretty much under every government, they all certainly said the words, we need to control migration, but as time went on, obviously that happened less and less and less. And Ken Clarke here clearly says getting control of the issue is obviously a priority. So fine, good on him. That is absolutely true, but to an awful lot of people, the situation is getting so desperate that the Reform Party, whose whole policy of one in, one out, which is, to my mind, so arbitrary, it barely makes any sense, but even I'm finding that a lot more suitable as a policy than anything that has come out of the Tory Party for the last decade and a half, that I think I'm going to vote for them based on that alone. And so I'm not saying, oh, just put through bad laws. Like, sure, scrutinise this thing, but from what I can tell from Clause 2, I don't really see any issue with it. The whole idea was that they get sent to Rwanda because we don't want them here, and if we say, if you come here, you're just going to get sent to Rwanda straight away, then what would be the issue?
And if they think we have lost control, then that threatens a very nasty change in public attitudes caused by doubts.
Well, slowly but surely you're certainly seeing more and more and more of that. And it's not just down to the lack of control on immigration, it's simply also down to the fact that people are seeing patterns. And, Callum from the Lotus Eaters have done perfectly good work going around the most native parts of the country and the least native parts of the country and showing what the difference is. And I think he did a very good job of not poisoning the well for any of the particular places he went to in that video. But it seemed quite clear to me that the more native side, especially in the rural areas, was a lot, for lack of a better term, it felt a lot more like home to someone like me and a lot of people in the comments than the places that were less native. So honestly, Ken Clarke, I'm afraid to say I think the cat's already out the bag. I genuinely don't think there's anything the Tories can do at this point to change people's minds, because you've had 13 years. If you've not done anything for 13 years, why would you start now? Especially under Rishi Sunak, of all people, who is just useless.
I think we should all be proud of the relatively strong, multicultural, multi-ethnic society we've created in this country, much more successfully than most other European countries.
Well, that really depends on your metrics for success. And I'm not going to bother going through a load of studies to find which countries have more crime than others. One thing I think we can all agree on is that crime has certainly gone up in the past couple of decades. GDP per capita has effectively stayed stagnant since 2008. And given lefties are constantly telling us that immigrants are just better people than the Brits, it's kind of hard to agree with that when you look at those statistics. Having said that, absolutely nobody has had any problem, from what I can tell, with Norwegian or Swedish immigrants. So being picky with where all these people are coming from, I think, is absolutely necessary.
And I think that's going to be threatened by reactions to illegal immigration if it obviously starts to grow again and is out of control.
Look, it's not just illegal immigration, it's also legal migration. In recent times, if you watch the other side of the hill religiously, we've pretty much almost weekly had stories of people who should have been deported but weren't. And they've turned out to be murderers, ISIS terrorists, crime bosses in drug gangs, most of whom legally came over here, should have been deported for committing crimes but weren't, either due to activist lawyers or activists directly on these deportation flights. And we've ended up in a worse situation because of it. People literally losing their lives because of this. And so, illegal migration, yes, it's absolutely symbolic, but people would still absolutely have a problem even with the amount of legal migrants coming over. Again, 700,000 net last year. When you actually look at the gross, it's quite close to 1 million in 1 year.
I did actually think that the safe third country proposal, if you could find a safe third country, was worth a try, and I continue to back it in principle.
Again, I want to make it clear in this video, I do have a lot of respect for Ken Clarke. Yes, he did the whole Westminster bubble thing of, oh, we should be proud of our multicultural society, and yes, I think that's wrong. But quite clearly, he understands the quite desperate need to control our borders, and so at least he's listening to the electorate, even from the House of Lords.
What happened was that policy hit a brick wall when it got to the Supreme Court.
Yes. Thank you, Tony Blair, for taking these powers away from the House of Lords into this quote-unquote independent body. This independent body that years ago was trying to stop Brexit as well as every other independent body in the UK. Go on then, what did the Supreme Court do this time?
And it failed in the Supreme Court, not because any finding of international law that a policy of using a safe third country was in any way contrary to any convention. The Refugee Convention, the European Convention on Human Rights.
Well, it's good to see it didn't use the excuse of international law in the UK, because if it did that, you're asking for quite the constitutional crisis there, given that Parliament is sovereign. But I'll get into detail on that later.
Government was defeated on an issue of fact. 5 Supreme Court judges considered the evidence which had been submitted to the High Court, and all 5 of them were persuaded that on that evidence, which they had heard arguments testing, Rwanda was not a safe country for this purpose, particularly because of the risk of refoulement.
So yes, just to expand on this, the Supreme Court's judgment was a decisive loss for the government back in November of 2023, and the Supreme Court has held unanimously that the government's Rwanda scheme is unlawful. The court found that there were substantial grounds for believing that asylum seekers sent to Rwanda would face a real risk of ill treatment as a result of refoulement or being returned to their country of origin. Now, what is interesting on this is that refoulement is prohibited by numerous international law instruments, including the ECHR, the UN Refugee Convention, the UN Convention Against Torture, and the UN International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. So interestingly, there's nothing actually in British law that actually would stop us from sending them over there. Because, again, the Supreme Court shouldn't be able to block Parliament on the basis of international law, unless Parliament has passed those same laws through Parliament themselves and they've got royal assent. They are the only types of laws that the Supreme Court can stop Parliament from, or sorry, I should say challenge Parliament on passing a law on, that it is contradicting another law. And this has actually happened in this case. Those instruments have been given effect in the UK national law by the Human Rights Act 1998, Asylum and Immigration Appeals 1993, the Nationality, Immigration and Asylum Act 2002, and the Asylum and Immigration Treaty of Claimants, etc. Act of 2004. But the thing is as well, when it comes to parliamentary sovereignty, there's no reason that Parliament can't repeal these laws or amend them. And Parliament does this all the time. And you may be asking, well, why doesn't Parliament and Rishi Sunak do this then? Well, I think the large reason is because if you are saying we're going to amend or repeal the Human Rights Act, or we're going to amend or repeal the Asylum and Immigration Appeals Act 1993, you're asking for headlines to effectively call you a dictator, which is why I think they're going for the other route of trying to make a new law that says, forget all that stuff, we say Rwanda is a safe country. And I actually think this is fairly reasonable because according to the Human Rights and Rule of Law Index from the globaleconomy.com, the latest value for Rwanda is 6.1 from a scale of 0 to 10, close to 0 being the more human rights and rule of law countries. In other words, the lower the better. And 6.1, yes, it's above 5 and it may seem quite high, but this is actually lower than some countries we have on the safe list, as India is currently on the safe list with a value of 7.4. This is relatively high, yet still considered safe by Parliament, so I don't see any good reason that Rwanda can't be put on the same level as it, given that by human rights indexes it is safer than India, a safe country.
Now, the government's reaction, which we're asked to improve, is quite startling to me. They have decided to bring an Act of Parliament to overturn a finding of fact made by the Supreme Court of this country, and if we pass this bill, we are asserting as a matter of law that Rwanda is a safe country for this purpose, that it is always going to be a safe country for this purpose until the law is changed, and the courts may not even consider any evidence brought before them to try to demonstrate that it's not a safe country.
Well, if it gets through the House of Commons and then the House of Lords, yeah, that is exactly the case, yes. Now, you can argue one way or the other whether you want that to be the case or not, and that's exactly why we have the House of Commons and the House of Lords. Although the House of Lords has just turned into essentially a big house where each party just crams in as many peers as they can. But my problems with the House of the Lords is a completely different subject anyway. The point being that everything Ken Clarke says is correct there. If this bill goes through the House of Lords and the House of Commons and goes to royal assent, as it is now, yes, courts literally cannot do anything but declare Rwanda a safe country when it comes to any appeal, and therefore we can just deport anyone we like to Rwanda if they have been found to be entering this country illegally. But again, given Parliament is sovereign, it is well within its power to do this.
This is a very dangerous constitutional provision. I hope it will be challenged properly in the courts, because we have an unwritten constitution, but it gets more and more important that we do make sure that powers in this country are controlled by some constitutional limits and are subject to the rule of law.
So this is where my biggest problem with the speech comes in, because one of his first claims here is that we have an unwritten constitution. I don't know why people keep saying this, and I don't know why Ken Clarke of all people has said this, because it should be common knowledge for veteran parliamentarians. No, we do not have an unwritten constitution. It is written, it is just not codified in a single document. So the UK is often said to have an unwritten constitution. This is not strictly correct. It is largely written, but in different documents. It has never been codified, brought together in a single document. In this respect, the UK is different from most other countries with a codified constitution. But not all. New Zealand and Israel also lack a codified constitution. Now, if he said we don't have a codified constitution, that'd be fine, but it is certainly written down. Codified constitutions are typically produced following a major historic turning point, such as the grant of independence, revolution, defeat in war, or complete collapse of the previous system of government. None of these things have happened in the UK, which is why it has never had cause to codify its constitution. While one revolution in the 17th century, well, violent revolution, did briefly produce a written constitution, Cromwell's instrument of government. But that constitution effectively made Cromwell king in all but name. Naturally, people hated it so much that we ended up just completely getting rid of it. We agreed Parliament has sovereignty, and that's why all these different parts of the Constitution that are written effectively say Parliament has the power to pretty much make anything law and to repeal anything before that came into law. In other words, the only thing that matters when it comes to making laws is the current Parliament. It can make and get rid of any law it wishes, even if it makes absolutely no sense. But to go even further and to remind you of what Ken Clarke said, he said this.
The powers in this country are controlled by some constitutional limits and are subject to the rule of law.
So, given that Parliament is sovereign, it is literally above the law. As Parliament's own website says, parliamentary sovereignty is a principle of the UK Constitution, which again is written but not codified. It makes Parliament the supreme legal authority in the UK, which can create or end any law. Generally, the court cannot overrule its legislation, and no parliament can pass laws that future parliaments cannot change. Parliamentary sovereignty is the most important part of the UK Constitution. And as mentioned before, the only reason that courts can actually get involved is, as the example before showed, saying to Parliament, no, you cannot make this law, it contradicts previous laws. In which case, that's not the court overruling the legislation from Parliament, so that is Parliament contradicting itself and the court saying, well, this is unworkable. And the thing about this new Safety of Rwanda bill is that it doesn't contradict any law. It just says these laws can't apply because Parliament says that Rwanda is safe. And finally, when it comes to limits of parliamentary sovereignty, well, these limitations are self-imposed by Parliament themselves, and because Parliament make and get rid of any law they want, there's no reason they can't have these limits taken away. But as the Parliamentary website says, Parliament has passed laws that limit the application of parliamentary sovereignty, and these laws reflect political developments both within and outside of the UK. So they include the devolution of powers to bodies like the Scottish Parliament and Senedd Cymru, the Human Rights Act 1998, the UK's entry into the EU in 97 and its exit in 2020, and a decision to establish a UK Supreme Court in 2009 which ends the House of Lords function as the UK's final court of appeal. So as I say, there's actually no reason that Parliament can't pass a bill that actually revokes the Supreme Court and puts their power back into the hands of the House of Lords. But again, there's nothing in here that limits Parliament from effectively making a law that makes absolutely no sense. That is for Parliament to debate within itself and finally be passed along to royal ascension.
Somebody has already said in this debate that Parliament apparently, in the claiming the sovereignty of Parliament, could claim that the colour black is the same as the colour white.
Yes, it is quite funny that he's using the colour black can be the colour white analogy when another analogy always was Parliament can say men or women, given that there are people in the Houses of Parliament that unironically wants that passed in law. And again, there's nothing within Parliament actually stopping that other than the MPs and the Lords themselves. In other words, the people that make up Parliament. So yes, Parliament can pass a law that says white is black and then enforce that law, but obviously that is unlikely to actually go through due to the debates process and the numerous readings that these laws have to go through when going through Parliament. And the main way we keep checks on that? We have elections every 5 years to get MPs in that we trust. The problem is that the choice of all our MPs are, as the old South Park saying goes, between giant douches and turd sandwiches.
More seriously, that someone who's been acquitted of a criminal charge is guilty of that criminal charge and should be returned to the courts for sentence.
Well, again, the only way Parliament are going to do that is by repealing a load of laws that contradict that. This is the way that Parliament has developed ever since the Civil War, and possibly even before that. Parliament was the place where these laws were debated, put in place and enforced. And the point of these courts is to say, no, you can't have this piece of legislation, government or Parliament, because we're enforcing another act of Parliament that is stopping you. So Parliament is fighting itself, and that's why it needs to repeal old laws. And this is part of the problem with the system we've got at the moment. We had 7 laws a day on average under Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. We are probably at a point with our laws where they are so intertwined and knotted that it would actually, you could probably just find any piece of legislation that contradicts a new piece of law. But this is the other funny thing about laws in the UK. If they're not enforced, who cares? And this is why there's probably no point to actually do a reset on the laws back to 1997 before we got Tony Blair. It's mainly because most of those 7 laws a day that were put into place are probably ignored anyway. But back to the point at hand, yes, Parliament can technically just make any law they want as long as it is not contradicting another act of Parliament. But this is the point I'm making. There are so many acts of Parliament that you will just never get passed through the Commons to repeal that it's pointless even trying to make that argument. Like, yes, in technicality they can do it. Are they going to do it in reality? No. Well, the courts are challenging the government at every point when they're trying to make these new laws for Rwanda, so you've got your ideal world anyway, Mr. Clarke.
Where are the limits? I always fear, as time goes by in my career, echoes of the warnings that Quinton Hailsham used to give us all about the risks of moving towards an elected dictatorship in this country. And the sovereignty of Parliament has its limits, which are the limits of the rule of law, the separation of powers, and what ought to be the constitutional limits on any branch of government in a liberal democratic society such as ours.
So, a few problems yet again. For some reason, he uses the terms separation of power, which we don't have in the UK. And I think this research file puts it best from the House of Commons, that says in the United Kingdom and other common law jurisdictions, however, the theory of separation has enjoyed much less prominence. In the UK, the major office and institutions have evolved to achieve balance between the Crown and more recently government and Parliament. The system resembles a balance of powers more than a formal separation of the 3 branches, or what Walter Bagehot called a fusion of powers in the English Constitution. In the last decade, the concept of separation of powers is evident in a number of policy initiatives. Previous government suggested that in its reforms of the judiciary in the Constitutional Reforms Act 2005, it was moving towards a more formal separation of powers. The creation of an independent Supreme Court and dismantling of the many-faceted office of Lord Chancellor have unpicked some aspects of the fusion of powers. Matters have also been complicated by the Human Rights Act of 1998 and its requirement for judges to consider the European Convention on Human Rights and the decisions of the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg. More recently, the proposed change in the number of members of Parliament, use of parliamentary privilege and members' involvement in super-injunctions have again raised issue of the interaction of institutions of the state. One thing I would like you all to notice, dear listeners, is that absolutely all of these things about the separations of power, whether it be the Constitutional Reform Act or Human Rights Act or the Supreme Court, all under Tony Blair. If we are going to be talking, Mr. Clarke, about an electoral dictatorship, I don't think we have seen anything more radical in the way that the British government and Parliament works than by the elective dictatorship we had under Tony Blair. Again, Tony Blair was well within his rights to do this as long as he could pass it all through Parliament, which he did. But every single Conservative government after that also had the right to repeal this, and none of them did. And none of them are going to, because at the end of the day, at the heart of all these people pumps Blairite blood. And until we have a proper counter-revolution, these problems are only going to get worse. So I would thank you, Mr. Clarke, as a veteran Tory MP, to not just play straight into New Labour's games and Americanise the whole system and support Americanising the whole system.
The way this should be resolved is, the government says, the facts have changed. We're not hearing arguments testing those arguments. I'm meant to cast a vote as to whether Rwanda is safe, and I've received an email, the text of the government's treaty, and the explanatory notes. I do not have the expertise on Rwanda that the Bishop of Durham has just demonstrated. I've never been there. I know it's been a one-man dictatorship for over 20 years, that we sometimes give refugee status here to people fleeing persecution in Rwanda, and indeed that it has, not as bad as some African countries, but has a rather dodgy record on human rights in various respects. I'm not surprised by the judgment.
All this is probably relatively true. You don't get above 5 on the Human Rights Index and not seem a bit dodgy. But the thing is that is this place going to be safe for refugees? If everyone's honest with themselves, they have no idea. We don't know. The people that have the best idea are obviously the Home Secretary and the Foreign Secretary, who obviously go over to visit there to see what is going to happen to refugees and also write the agreements as to what is going to be in the deal and how they're going to treat refugees within that deal. And then at this point we're saying, well, do we trust the Rwandans at their word? Well, I have no idea. I don't think anyone does. But a counter-argument can be made here. Yes, there have in the past been human rights abuses in Rwanda. There have been in many safe countries, though, that we have on the list. I'm just going to be honest with you. Most people are just fed up with having to wait. We're fed up with waiting for a solution. We just want one. And if it means going to Rwanda and there is a risk that they are found not to be refugees by Rwanda standards and are sent back, breaking this international law, then so be it. That is Rwanda's problem. Again, we need push factors. Immigrants are coming over too easily because they're getting a load of money, are given leave to work, and if they're not, they work illegally, and then they cause problems for the areas they're in. People are fed up with it. At what point do we say the people living in these areas right to go about their normal business and not have to be neighbours with de facto criminals matters more than these criminals risking being sent back to their countries that, let's face it, they have probably lied about to get into the country in the first place? We don't know, but our legislation is such a mess that it's no wonder we can't actually do anything to get it through. And don't get me wrong, I understand that it is Ken Clarke's job to make sure that all these pieces of legislation are properly scrutinised. That is his job as a lord. But I would love to hear if he has any alternatives to sending people to Rwanda, because he seems to be completely on board with sending people to a safe third country. He just doubts that Rwanda is safe, but does admit that he doesn't entirely know. As I'm saying, I don't entirely know, but I'm definitely on the side of please just get this through. I am fed up of it. And Ken Clarke understands that. As I say, I have respect for him as a parliamentarian and a veteran politician, but I don't understand why he has just put out misinformation in the House of Lords about how parliamentary sovereignty works. That part I don't get.
But the government says things have changed, but I have no means of testing that, and I agree with all those who've said Change is subject to the Rwandans actually complying with the treaty, to the training being effective, to change on the ground, reaching the required standard, and periodic checks being made of that.
You know what? Fine. As long as Rwanda do all that, can we please get this law passed to call it a safe country? Can we please just do that? I am perfectly fine. I think that is reasonable. Because we have given Rwanda hundreds of millions of pounds for this scheme, and we are yet to send anyone over there. Please, just get this through and get them deported. Rwanda, we've sent you enough money. You just have to agree with this.
And that is not what Clause 2 is actually setting out, and which we're asked to approve. So,
yep, you know what? You're right. That doesn't mean that it can't be made law, though. At the end of the day, this is Ken Clarke's standard. We can only call Rwanda a safe country once it has signed up to the UN Refugee Convention, and once they have agreed to periodic checks from British civil servants that the refugees are not being abused. To put my cynical hat on for a second, none of that is actually necessary to pass this law in the first place anyway, but if it will get the vote of the Lords with those amendments, fine with me. Fair enough. Look at that, the checks and balances with parliamentary sovereignty in action. You love to see it. It's beautiful.
I do hope that we consider this bill with very particular care. I'm probably going to be attracted to support some pretty startling amendments which go to some of the main purposes in the bill. I do think if the government wishes to demonstrate that facts have changed, then some means should be found of going back to the court, facing another challenge, having a proper hearing of up-to-date evidence, and in the light of demonstrated improvement in the situation of Rwanda, getting a fresh judgment, if necessary, from the Supreme Court.
I mean, I complain about the Supreme Court again here, but the fact of the matter is that that process would just be done through the House of Lords instead if we had it in the old way, so I'm not going to bother complaining about that too much. But again, he's just reiterating, I'm only going to vote for this piece of legislation to go through if we can actually guarantee Rwanda is a safe country, because, to be fair to him, it's the job of Parliament. Yes, they should try and reflect reality as much as possible, I do agree, and the best way to do that is through rigorous debate like this. As I want to reiterate again, much respect for Ken Clarke as a professional statesman. Don't really understand why he doesn't understand how the processes his whole professional life have gone through works, though, but maybe he's senile, I don't know.
Meanwhile, search for other safe countries. Don't vote for the Liberal amendment today.
And that's his opinion, and it's not an unreasonable opinion to have in the House of Lords. That is fair enough. And Mr. Clarke does indeed end this speech on quite a salient note.
Because as Lord Blunkett has said, although I'd love to see the Conservative Party got out of this particular mess, the main effect of that would be to get the government out of the hole that it's dug for itself.
I even think whole singular is quite underselling the point here. The government has dug itself into many holes on immigration, what with promising to bring immigration down, net immigration down I should say, to tens of thousands of people, which they've managed to do the opposite of somehow. Done nothing to defend the borders from illegal migrants. Not managed to successfully change the law to say if someone comes over here illegally, they are instantly deported. Keep finding themselves in situations where they try and deport someone and as Ken Clarke's about to say, unelected bodies keep finding ways to stop said deportations, and if it's not unelected bodies, it is random leftist nutters on planes that are stopping them. That was a true story recently. But again, I'm not putting too much emphasis on the House of Lords being terrible here. I think Ken Clarke is doing a good job for his position. It's just the number of people, not only in the House of Lords, but in the House of Parliament, that don't understand how Parliament actually works is quite staggering. We've had plenty of MPs who use phrases like separations of power and limits of Parliament as if they mean anything, because all of the limits of Parliament are imposed by Parliament, and because they're imposed by Parliament, they can actually be repealed. Technically, Parliament has no limits when it comes to laws. And at this point, I just want to say we are a country that deserves to decline, because people keep getting voted in that don't even understand how the system works and almost show off how little of the system they actually understand. as if it's a badge of honour to not completely understand their own jobs. Anyway, I'll let Ken Clarke finish off his speech here.
They have absolutely based far too much on this Rwandan policy, putting it at the heart of their political ambitions for the election, to be able to turn round and said they would have stopped the boats, but the unelected House of Commons,
I think it means House of Lords there,
and the Liberal Democrats and the metropolitan elite stopped them, will be a save this government from what I think are its follies in crashing on with this particular policy in this way, and I hope we won't fall into that trap, at least in our proceedings.
Ken Clarke is absolutely right there. There have been far too much put into this policy that I think Rishi Sunak knew would not work. And from what Suella Braverman said in her letter to him, I think everyone understands that Rishi Sunak is just plodding along with this to, as Ken Clarke says, try and say, oh, well, I tried to stop the boats, but I couldn't because of X, Y, and Z. And maybe next time he will use parliamentary legislation to limit powers of the House of Lords, of the metropolitan elite, whatever. And luckily for the House of Lords and Ken Clarke, nobody really cares. Nobody cares what Rishi Sunak has to say. I don't think many people could give you Rishi Sunak's policy platform, despite the amount of graphics they put out about their 5-point plan of halving inflation and stopping the boats, because no one's seeing any real results from any of that. I mean, okay, they cut national insurance recently, but people, again, aren't really caring about that because, okay, it earned me an extra £30, but oh wow, I get to fill up the car once more at a petrol station. But I do want to say at this point, I do find it very funny that the liberal lefty types that are all about trying to expand the franchise to 16-year-olds and saying democracy is absolutely based and the best thing ever, seem to absolutely love the fact that this unelected House of Lords is doing their best to stop the bill, amend the bill, it doesn't really matter. Point is that these people aren't serious about democracy. The main reason they want 16-year-olds to vote is because they know the only 16-year-olds that are going to be voting will be for Labour and for the parties that they want. It's not on any particular point of principle, or it might be for some people, I don't know, but certainly for the people that are saying, oh my god, I love the House of Lords now, those are the type of people that you should not trust when they say, I am speaking on principle here, because they're lying. They're completely lying. They would love to have a dictatorship of centre-left to radical left-wing people, because they think that anything that is described as progress is a good thing, whereas people like me, and I assume a lot of you watching this channel would say, no, let's actually turn back the clocks. They're telling the wrong time at the moment. Let's go back down this road we've been going down, because I don't like the fact that it is completely changing the face of my country to something I don't like, and that's very reasonable. But anyway, my point being here, Ken Clarke, for some reason as a veteran parliamentarian and politician, doesn't seem to understand what parliamentary sovereignty is, doesn't seem to understand how Parliament actually works, and yet somehow has been in the business for over 50 years. And I'm telling you now, the people below him still in the House of Commons will have even less understanding, or at least most of them will. We have people literally running the country that don't seem to even understand how it works. But as I say, Ken Clarke here has done a good job, and his job as a Lord. I am perfectly fine with him scrutinising this bill in the way he has. I obviously would like to see this bill come through, but if his only contention is, I want full guarantees that Rwanda will be a safe country and has actually explained what his criteria for that are, that's fair enough. That is far better than what I see from Labour, Lib Dem, Green MPs and the like. If we had more people like Ken Clarke, our country would be in a much better state. That is what I'm saying. But we need Ken Clarke that actually understand how the system works too, because that would just be perfection. That should probably be the minimum standard for being an MP, but unfortunately, Parliament doesn't limit who can get into Parliament in that way. And I honestly think that's a bit crazy, but there we are. Anyway, that's everything I had for you today. So once again, thank you very much for watching, and until next time, goodbye.